Do you ever wonder what's happening with your fisheries in your country? Well, I'm always wondering what's happening here in Canada, as I've done work with stock assessments in my graduate work, and I'm always curious. But it's really hard to get a hold of the data, and it's really difficult to get a summary of the data, a good summary of the data and what is happening to those fish stocks. So lo and behold, we have the Oceana Canada's Fisheries Audit. It's the 7th annual Fisheries Audit. It was just released, and unfortunately, the results are not great. But we're going to talk about it on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is a podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. I am your host, and I'm here to talk about the fisheries audit that Oceana Canada released November 21st on Fisheries Day, World Fisheries Day. And I'm going to be honest, the results are not great. In summary of the results, I'm going to just give you a quick summary, because in the interview with Rebecca Schijns, I go through with her, how the audit was done, what we're looking at in terms of the results, going through the results in detail, why people should be, looking at this, what they can do, what they're hoping that the government of Canada does, how Oceana Canada is working with the government to do this, and how they're briefing them on the results, and just everything that needs to happen with this, and how we can get to a better managed fisheries Canada-wide. And so, unfortunately, the results this year are not very great. So we had a third of marine fish and invertebrate populations are either critically depleted or in the cautious zone, and less than 1/3 can be considered healthy. That doesn't sound very good. There's some without status. Nearly 40% of all marine fish and invertebrate populations are classified as uncertain due to insufficient reference points and stock status information. And then without a plan, only 6 of 28 critically depleted stocks have a rebuilding plan. Only 6 out of 28. And none of those are high quality. So that means there's gaps in those plans, those rebuilding plans. These few plans fail to meet the criteria that is laid out in the Fisheries Act rebuilding regulations. And there were no new rebuilding plans published this year, despite legal requirements to do so for 13 critical stocks by 2024. Rebecca says that in the new year, before April 2024, there are supposed to be 13 critical stocks, rebuilding stocks that are going to be published. The rebuilding plans for those stocks that are going to be published. So hopefully we are going to see them. But that's all that information is in this interview with Rebecca Schijns from Oceana Canada. Enjoy the interview, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Rebecca, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about a fisheries audit?
I'm as ready as ever.
Right on. I'm very excited about this. This is something that I've always wanted to talk about, but I've never really had the opportunity to talk about a fisheries audit. Just to give a quick background, I was involved in my master's degree way back, like 20, more than 20 years ago. My gosh. And I dealt with stock assessments for the Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And that's what we're going to be talking about is what is the status and of our fisheries in Canada. And so that's something exciting for me to know. Obviously, I know a bit of the results, and they're not so exciting. They're a little worrisome, but this is why we do these audits, so that we can identify what's happening and then how we can rectify that. So we're going to talk about sort of the paths of how we can rectify it and how Oceana Canada is working on that. But we have Rebecca here. And Rebecca, why don't you just let people know who you are and what you do?
Thank you. My name is Rebecca Schijns, and I am a fisheries scientist with Oceana Canada. And I'm located in Vancouver, where I spend a lot of time out on the water, diving and exploring nature and all of our amazing sea critters. And I have a pretty extensive academic background in fishery science. And I'm now working at this amazing ocean conservation nonprofit, trying to drive some lasting change for protecting our oceans in Canada.
Yeah, amazing. I actually have so many questions just based off of what you said. So first of all, I'm very envious that you get to see the beautiful mountains and the ocean all in one spot. That must be just something that is just out of this world. You say you love to dive. What's your favorite animal you like to dive and see?
I feel like
that you've gone diving with.
Any marine biologist can never answer that question fully because they're all my favorites.
Of course.
But, anytime I have a close encounter with anything from, a beautiful sea star to a great hammerhead, it's always a kind of moment that you remember forever. So, yeah, I can't pick a favorite.
Oh, I get it. I totally get it. And you mentioned, working in fisheries before. Did you go to university in BC?
I did my master's at UBC in oceans and fisheries and my undergrad at Queen's University in biology.
Very nice. Fantastic schools. And so, getting into fisheries, what led you to go into that path?
So I was always really, nature-oriented person, as I mentioned, spending a lot of time in the outdoors. And the kind of curiosity that comes with that drew me to academia and biology. And then, some of the focus of those studies took me to the land underwater, and I've been captured by that ever since. And then outside of academia, pursued some really interesting internships working in the Bahamas on shark research and as a diver at an aquarium in Toronto. And that kind of brought me back to pursuing higher education to learn more about how I can make impactful research and lasting change. And that kind of brought me to Oceana Canada.
We had your colleague, Anthony Morente, on a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about plastics, and we were talking about sort of the Oceana campaign and how all the court system and stuff was going on with plastics and the whole toxic categorization. I asked him, what led him to work with Oceana. Even before that, he worked with World Wildlife Fund. And he wanted to go into conservation and saying the same thing. He wanted to make a difference. Now, you've had, quite an extensive experience, working in the Bahamas and then working, for an aquarium. What made you want to work for a nonprofit? Like, what made you want to make that, like, as you mentioned, make that difference? What led you to that? Was it a specific moment? Was it something you observed during that time, or is it something you've always wanted to do?
I would say my interests and kind of I align very strongly with how nonprofits operate, specifically science-based organizations that are driving for direct policy action, and that's something Oceana Canada is really good and concentrated at doing. And so it was a no-brainer to me when I thought of my dream job, really working for an organization that like Oceana Canada. Tackling, some of the biggest ocean threats at a national scale so that we can see solutions, year to year that rebuild abundance to our oceans.
And I'll be honest, I was really excited when Oceana Canada came to Canada, and when it was started, CEO, executive director, Josh Logren, who's fantastic. I've known him for over a decade now. And I really enjoyed it because not a lot of organizations were coming out with information on stock assessments or even just information on fishery stocks and invertebrate stocks. Yet we are a country that has an extensive, sort of fishing history, and it continues to I guess, thrive in terms of the fishing industry. It continues, but we're not thriving in terms of the fishery stocks. And there's been some controversy over, past 20 years of, do we continue to monitor stocks? At one point, the fisheries and oceans weren't really monitoring stocks, and then they were again. And so there's been a lot of history there. There's been a lot of information that comes out, but it gets confusing after a while. And we just don't know I feel as though if I asked sort of one of my friends, what state is the fishery stocks in here, and who has no idea about conservation necessarily, they'll probably be like, I have no idea. I don't have a clue. Having these fisheries audits, and this is the 7th annual one, having this out is really important. Has this something, when you started with Oceana, is this something you've always worked on?
I started going into more depth in conducting stock assessments myself in my master's. But prior to that, I really had a limited knowledge of even what the definition of a stock was. And I think a lot of people are confused by that term because it's an economic term that we're using on our fish populations and the kind of management unit of those fish populations. And so there was a big learning curve for me there. And I, have to be able to communicate it to people as well that aren't in this science world. And so, it's really about the information that the government is using and the science that the government is using to understand the state of our fisheries and to be able to design management measures that, are based in evidence that can support healthy fisheries. And so we've seen a lot of gaps in that system of both having enough baseline knowledge to be able to make good, sound decisions, as well as having the evidence and, that evidence not making its way into the good management decisions that aren't, making their way into lasting change more than, a year-to-year basis. We need to have a long-term vision that the government has committed to, but to be able to deliver for the betterment of our oceans and for coastal communities.
Right. Now, when did you start working on these fisheries audits with Oceana Canada?
So the 2022 fishery audit was the first one that I worked on from start to finish. And prior to that, I did a contract for Oceana on assessing the uncertain stocks. So the ones that the government doesn't have a determined stock status for. And still to this day, in the latest fishery audit, there's still 40% of Canada's fisheries that are in that uncertain stock category when, based on some of my research and others, that a lot of these stocks can be estimated to be in a depleted state. So it's about using the best available information so we have a better understanding of the state of our fisheries.
I mean, knowledge is power when it comes to these things, right? And the fact that we don't have that knowledge in a lot of these, there's not that information is really scary, coming from that point. So it's good to have this fisheries audit. Now, does the government, and this fisheries audit is really for all of Canada. It's not just for like Atlantic Canada or Western Canada or Arctic. This is for all of Canada. It's really an all-encompassing document. And it provides a lot of information. But the government of Canada never releases something like this, does it?
They have a sustainability survey that they conduct for a subset of the stocks that we analyze. And we use that as kind of our baseline input to the fishery audit. And that kind of has some similar indicators, but really not in depth as we go into our audit indicators on science, monitoring, and management measured on a year-to-year basis.
Okay. Now, who is this fisheries audit document for? Like, who is it targeted to? Is it targeted towards your supporters? Is it targeted towards sort of like academic and science community? Or is it really targeted just say, hey, DFO, like we're looking at this, fisheries and oceans, this is what we've looked at. This is what we've come up with. We need to have a little chit chat about this.
We definitely have chit chats with the government about our annual fishery audit. But it really is a multi-purpose tool. Our primary reason is to hold the government accountable every year on what they say that they're going to deliver on terms of managing fisheries and what actually gets done on very clearly measurable scale for 194 marine fish and invertebrates across all the regions in Canada. And so we do actually go around to each region in Canada and brief them on our results before we release them. We give a chance, the opportunity to review the data that goes into our audit because it is all based on what DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, publicly releases.
Yeah.
Which we scan. I scan hundreds of documents for the information that we measure. And, we use this tool all year round throughout, we like to share publicly what is going on and what the public can do to drive the minister and the department to deliver on these commitments. So,
Yeah.
And then, of course, academics also use this data set. It's 7 years of over 9 indicators. And so a lot of different analyses have kind of come out of this audit over the years. And that's really an interesting way to see, the innovative use of this data set by a whole bunch of different communities.
Well, and I worked on a subset of the Atlantic Canada data back in 2003, 2004. It was for 4 years previous to that, from 1999, I think, to 2003. And it was their summer survey and their trawl survey and so forth. And it was not easy to get that data. My professor had some connections, some former students. I went to University of Guelph, so a lot of University of Guelph people who are in the marine biology program end up going out to the Bedford Institute, and he had connections, and he used those connections to get that data. And these data sets are public. They're supposed to be public accessible documents, but they're not easy to get. You have to know who you need to speak to, and the scientists are willing to share it. But they're just not easy to get. That's just for one document. It took us a while to get. I can just imagine, like one Excel file. I can just imagine how much more difficult it is to look for all the species that you're looking for and trying to get all of that data. Obviously, it's probably a little bit like the workflow is and accessing the data is probably a little smoother now. But have you heard like sort of the stories of when these fisheries audits first came? Like, was it difficult to get access to that data?
Yeah, and that's something that we've actually really seen a big difference of since we started doing these audits. Mm-hmm. We started doing these audits back in 7 years ago because there was such limited publicly accessible information on the status of our fish stocks, and it really wasn't found in like a consistent way. And since then, there have been new transparency requirements, and we've seen better plans that come out that have more detailed information. We've seen the government, which is something we advocated for, to release publicly available work plans where they say, we are going to improve X, Y, and Z indicator over this year. Unfortunately, we've seen that the work plans have not been delivered upon year to year, but at least we're able to see that we're able to measure better with the more information that we're able to request for the government. And so, highlighting those gaps in the key information that we need to understand the status of our fish stocks is something we've been able to explore through the audit.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you talk about some of the gaps, like some of the work plans weren't completed some years, some they are. It could be very disconnected. What are the reasons for that? Is it just lack of resources on the government's part to have people to look after these types of fisheries or fisheries that may not be as popular? Or is it lack of funding by the government to be able to put that money out? Because I mean, they're talking about, assessing these stock assessments. Where is the disconnect, or like, why is it so disconnected for some fisheries?
Lack of funding may have been an argument in the past, but up until now, we've seen really substantial investments in the fisheries science and management programs in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And so we're really looking to see a focused and dedicated capacity to improve and, have real change on the water. A lot of good science is being done. It's just not making its way into these year-to-year decisions. We've seen a huge turnover in, the leadership of the department. 6 different ministers over 6 years, and we have a new fisheries minister this year. And we are really looking to see the new minister fulfill their mandate on fisheries sustainability. And looking ahead to 2024, some really important decisions to be made on key stocks like cod, capelin, mackerel, herring, and these decisions to include more fish under the amended Fisheries Act and the rebuilding regulations, which really provides fisheries in Canada the best possible protection to to be able to manage them to healthy levels.
At one point, I worked for Fisheries and Oceans during the Harper government years, and then the turnover to the Trudeau government during those types. So it was basically from 2013 to about 2017. At that point, at the end of sort of the Harper era, let's just say, there were a lot of changes to, obviously, you mentioned the amended Fisheries Act, but the Fisheries Act changed. It was basically gutted into certain levels where, there were rumors that, a lot of people got, the jobs got just taken out, of certain programs. One of those was the stock assessment program. The others were, the way fisheries was managed was not by habitat, but by, actual fisheries. And you had to have like a fisheries as established over the last 30 years. And there's it made it a lot harder to protect certain fisheries. I guess my question to you is, do you know if we've lost a lot of data during that time? Like, is there like a disconnect in the amount of data that was collected during that time? Or did those programs just go on, just people weren't really looking at it?
It definitely enabled this implementation gap to widen even more. And so we have seen, the tools that are now reinstated have had a slower time to be able to work their way into the whole fisheries management system. But now, and all that led to really widespread mismanagement, coming at great cost to fishers and Canadian communities across the country. And so right now we're in a time where we need to be focusing on rebuilding with the perspective that accounts for climate change and ecosystem considerations, delivering on the reconciliation agenda so that we have, more perspectives that are in the room when it comes to making these lasting decisions on our fish stocks. And so that's kind of the state we're at now, despite, and wrangling with the misdoings of the past. We really have to get beyond this and look towards a new narrative for our fisheries in Canada.
100%. Yeah, we need to turn that tide, so to speak. So it's great to have these fisheries audits. This is the 7th one. Let's go into the making of it. These are not easy documents to put together. I would imagine it takes the full year to put these audits together, or like this was released in October. Does it take like the full year? Are you guys already working on the next one? Is that how it works?
Yeah, it takes around 8 months from, conceptualizing, what are we going to do new every year? We like to bring more perspectives and possible indicators into the audit. For example, starting to measure how climate change is being accounted for across fisheries management, how Indigenous knowledge systems can improve fisheries sustainability and ecosystem resilience, and measuring the quality of rebuilding plans now that the new regulations have guidelines on what these plans should entail. So those are some of the new things that we brought into the audit this year. And we started thinking about that earlier in the year. And then, of course, we do the deep dive into the data. We look at all of the available government documents that were released over the past year. And that's, looking through hundreds of pages and data to kind of reformat into a more publicly accessible way, and then analyze those trends, and then write a lot of different reports and create a very nice, magazine-like report that we're able to share with the public and through some, social media assets and all of that. So, start to finish, there's a lot of different elements that go into the audit, and it ranges from, looking at very detailed numbers to, choosing impactful images that go along with the data to be able to share and hopefully reach a wide audience.
It's a fantastic document. I'm turning the pages as you were mentioning all the different, like, and the graphics are amazing. It actually makes it really easy to read. I think a lot of people, when they see a fisheries audit, they're like, oh, it's probably like packed full of, data and just tables, like pages and pages of tables, but they're actually really easy to go through. The images are spectacular, but it's a really interesting and compelling document to look at. Like, they have summary of recommendations. In 10 years, half of Canada's stocks could be healthy. Like, there's a lot of optimism that can come out of this if the right management regulations or just management actions can be taken. So it provides a great way of being optimistic for our fisheries. Obviously, that still has to be implemented. So the suggestions, that is, so it's still a lot more work to do. But going into some of these results, the interesting thing on page 4 and 5, you have the scorecard, like the actual 2023 scorecard. And it's really interesting. You look at the graph that says sort of the healthy status of Canada's fisheries from 2017 to 2023. And so we're looking at 4 different categories. You have healthy, cautious, critical, and uncertain. Can you just kind of give us that definition of each of those? And like, I think we can all have our own sort of definition of what healthy and what cautious and critical is, but based on this document, can you just kind of just describe briefly what those definitions are?
Yeah, so we use the government's own definitions on the status of fish stocks, and that's based on what we call the precautionary approach policy. So it's kind of like a traffic like measurement or management system where, when something is at a healthy level, that reflects, there's enough fish in that population to be supporting catches that can continue into the future at that level, at the maximum sustainable yield. And if that biomass can support a healthy catch. And then cautious kind of depicts that the population is declining. So perhaps there's fishing impacts that's higher than the population can support, or there's, environmental impacts that are causing that fish to decline. And so what managers can then do is to slow down and to catch less, or to have other protections. And then when that fish population dips into the critical zone, that is, the biological threshold where serious harm is occurring to the stock, and it's not able to reproduce at the rate that it normally would to be able to become healthy. And that's when management really needs to step in, and fishing must be at the lowest possible level. And then with the new rebuilding regulations in the Fisheries Act, that also now triggers a rebuilding plan that must be able to have, a long-term management plan to rebuild the stock. And then when we see the uncertain status, that means that there isn't enough baseline information to have defined those different thresholds. And that means that, the science has to step in and inform, what is the most precautionary measure that can be on this fish stock when we don't have enough information.
Right. And there's usually, I'm looking at these numbers, and we'll go through them in a second. It's a little scary to see how many uncertain there are compared to the rest of those categories. But let's look at some of these numbers here, because these are some of the major numbers that kind of stand out in the document. In 2017 for the healthy, it looked like almost 35% of the stocks were healthy. Now we're looking at a drop over time. It seems to increase for a couple of years, but in 2023 it dropped a little bit more to just under 30% to 28.4%. What does that indicate? Like, are we just losing stocks? Is that it? Like, is it just the number of stocks that we lost? I think it says 4 fewer healthy stocks. Is that what we're looking at here?
Yeah. So overall, there's less than a third of Canada's fisheries that are in the healthy stock status zone. And this has declined over the past 7 years. And we saw 4 fewer in the healthy zone from 2022 to 2023. Some of those stocks actually shifted to uncertain. And so, where there was baseline information, now it's deemed unreliable and, a new assessment
Gotcha.
has to take place, or
Okay.
it slipped into the cautious or critical zone. And that's, even more concerning, which means that fish is not being managed to
Right.
support a healthy fishery. And it is concerning that has declined over the past 7 years. That's definitely an alarm bell to us, and it should be for the government as well. And then, of course, where we really thought we'd see a big difference over the past 7 years was shifting more stocks from the uncertain category into healthy, cautious, or critical, because there are new guidelines to create those thresholds based on more limited information. And really think that is the best way to ensure that management measures are more based on more information.
This is really interesting. Before we go on with some of these percentages, how many stocks are we looking at, like that you looked at for this fisheries audit?
Yeah, we have been tracking and monitoring 194 marine fish and invertebrate stocks since 2017. And then in our data set, we have expanded that over time to over 200, around 230. And that really accounts for some of the non-targeted fisheries, fisheries that may be under moratorium for many years and therefore are not deemed, a commercially important stock to Canada. But we still think it's important to include them in the overall assessment. So
Right.
This is the most comprehensive data set for Canadian fish stocks.
I'm sure a lot of people didn't even think we had that many species in Canada, right? And so for the uncertain, it just means it doesn't meet the critical threshold of information that can give us a perspective on whether they fall within healthy, cautious, or critical, right? That's essentially what the uncertain is.
And it means that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans hasn't accepted a stock status or certain reference points for those stocks yet.
Now let's look at the cautious category. That increased quite a bit. So it looked like from just over 15% last year to 18%. And at one point, was that 2020? It was, up about 19%. I'm just guessing here. I'm just looking at the graph. But it's back up to 18. Then it fell down to probably about just over 15%. And now it's back up to 18%. What does that tell us in that respect? Is that some from the uncertain that have kind of been assessed and put in the cautious, or is that some from the healthy that have been put into that cautious as well?
It's a mix of both. There's less critical stocks this year, although it's still a very concerning amount of critical stocks. So some have shifted from critical to cautious, which is a good signal. And then others from healthy to cautious, which is a concerning signal. So that cautious zone is really, something to keep an eye on. And it's also an area where there usually is, an active fishery, and management really needs to step in to be able to ensure that those catches are based on the best available science that supports, positive growth.
Yeah. Okay. So we're probably looking at the cautious. We're probably looking about just over 40 species. Is that right? Or just under 40 species that are in the cautious, or 40 stocks, I should say. Given that, just the 18%, I'm looking at 194, just sort of on a. Okay, so that's
I think
it's nice to see that
35.
Okay, so it's nice to see that the critical has gone down. Is that a representation of when it gets to critical and sort of a plan is put into place that the plans are working?
Well, one of the most concerning things actually this year is that we didn't see any new rebuilding plans for any of these critical stocks. So there are 6 rebuilding plans in place for critical stocks, but out of the 28, that's still a number that don't have.
Not a lot.
Yeah. And we were expecting both the pace and the quality of rebuilding plans to increase since 2022, where these new regulations were put in place. And that, gave a target and a timeline to have 13 new rebuilding plans by April 2024. And so
Okay.
while we did see the drafts of a lot of these rebuilding plans, and we were able to review and submit recommendations to improve some of these plans, we didn't see any of them published this year. And so we are really, recommending the government put these plans in place before the next fishery season decisions that are to be made, usually in the spring. And so we're expecting at least 13 rebuilding plans by April, but we didn't see any this year. And so a lot of these critical stocks don't have that long-term vision to rebuild them. And they're really lacking the best recovery measures at this state.
When we look at the recovery and we look at these rebuilding plans for the stocks, is it just on a stock by stock basis, or are we looking at ecosystem protection and conservation when we talk about helping rebuild the stock? What goes into, like, say for the 6 that have the work plans and that are falling in the critical bin? What are the measures and the management that we're looking at? Because for me, from my background, was marine protected areas. You protect the ecosystem, and you end up helping the fisheries if everything is done right and is managed properly. What else goes into that, or is that part of it? And what else goes into that?
Yeah, it can be part of it, and habitat protection definitely should be a consideration in rebuilding fish stocks. Unfortunately, the plans that are available right now are not of high quality, and they don't meet the new criteria of the Fisheries Act, which requires both a defined target for rebuild, what the definition of this rebuilt stock would be, and a target a timeline to achieve that, as well as including, ecosystem considerations in the plan and socioeconomic considerations. And so the new rebuilding regulations have these requirements outlined, and that should mean that the rest of the plans that come out are more cohesive and consistent, both with, each other. What does rebuilding a forage fish like herring mean on the Atlantic side versus the Pacific side, and the different cod stocks. There should be some considerations between the linking of some predator-prey dynamics. We know how important capelin is to cod, and both of those stocks in the Northeast Atlantic are in a critical state. So what does rebuilding mean for both of those fisheries? We are looking to see more high quality rebuilding plans that consistently bring in ecosystem approaches, account for climate change impacts, because we know that fisheries are going to be experiencing the impacts both on short-term and long-term scales, and seeing the urgency of those plans being implemented so we can have more direction on managing our fisheries.
And it's really interesting. I'm just reading some of the sort of like the headline in the report: after big gains, progress has stalled. And as you mentioned, there's been significant investments. So some of those investments measured in this report was, just looking here. So we're looking at investments in monitoring via at-sea observers, electronic monitoring, dockside monitoring of landings, logbooks that record the entire catch, or some combination of these. So you would think there's more data on a lot of these stocks, but there seems to be a lack of information being processed. That's concerning to me. Has the government come out to say why?
So coincidentally, our fishery audit actually came out around the same time as the Office of the Auditor General, who did a specific audit on monitoring, which is, that compliance and enforcement of fisheries catches on the water, on the docks, so that information is feeding into the science. And that report also revealed pretty pervasive issues in fisheries monitoring, which we have been seeing over the past 7 years. You've noted the big gains, which was the fisheries monitoring policy that came out in 2019. But progress was stalled in the implementation of that policy. There's a lot of really good direction in that policy, and we have not yet seen the programs fully implemented on the water. And so really combined with our 7 years of tracking that and the Office of the Auditor General's report revealing the more specific systemic issues, that real implementation gap is coming at huge cost to the fishing community, and underpinning a lot of the bad decisions that have been made.
Right.
Because of course, if we can't reliably understand what we're catching, then how are you to have a good, a well-informed decision every year on what the quota should be?
Absolutely. I completely agree. When you released this in October, I believe.
November 21st, actually, World Fisheries Day.
Oh, November 21st. So okay, right on. So for World Fisheries Day, November 21st, which is, fairly recent when we did this. Has the government responded to this at all? Has the Fisheries and Oceans responded to this?
Yeah, so in October, we did, briefings with the regions in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and we shared our results and our recommendations to improve science monitoring and management over the next year. And we had a lot of positive input from those interactions, and a lot of things to follow up with, the government saying that is going on behind the scenes. And, for example, that some of the rebuilding plans are really well underway and just awaiting, a final sign off. And so we are, we gain a lot from those interactions and understanding the direction of the department, but also, we're here to hold them accountable to getting the job done.
Of course. And you have to. I mean, let's be honest, in the early 1990s, when we saw the official cod collapse, data scientists were telling the government, like the managers and the policy makers, as well as the politicians, that this was going to happen. This is inevitable if we don't change their management perspectives. And that's my experience when you speak to a lot of the data scientists who are looking at this data every year, collecting this data, seeing it in the field. You get a lot of positive feedback from them because they're just like, yeah, we want to have this change. So when you go to all the regions, you're probably talking to a lot of the scientists who are working on these stocks. Do you interact with the managers as well as the politicians, like the local politicians that are in those regions that have a vested interest in fisheries because it's a part of their, the representation of their riding? And do you get feedback from them?
Yeah, absolutely. We work with a lot of folks in communities, and we think it's really important to talk to the leadership in those communities, and share our results and, field any questions that they may have. And so we like to get a lot of input on our recommendations as well, to ensure that they are reflecting a wide base of people's priorities for rebuilding abundance to our oceans, and highlight some of the solutions to the people that can make those decisions.
And then do you speak to the minister themselves?
Not directly. As you know, the newest minister has been taking office at the end of the summer. And so we haven't had a chance to meet with her directly yet. But we definitely circulate this audit and our letters of recommendation to their office.
You mentioned earlier that we've had 6 fisheries ministers in as many years. How does that affect, presenting this to the minister, like presenting this data and the trends? How does that affect the minister's office in the way that they can, that you find, like Oceana's position on how it affects sort of implementing these management priorities? you find like there's data lost in there or knowledge lost in there when you get that? I mean, it's a lot of turnover, right? Like, why is that turnover, and how does it affect sort of the way we manage fisheries as a country?
Yeah, there definitely can be. And, different ministers bring different perspectives into the position. And now we have, a minister that's from the Atlantic region, and previously we had someone from the Pacific region. And so there's, a very clear difference sometimes in those priorities and familiarity with, regional fisheries issues. But really looking into the mandate for the previous minister and this minister hasn't changed. And they are accountable to the same mandate for rebuilding abundance and progressing on meeting these commitments, both at a national and international scale. And so that's really where we focus our efforts on is, making that consistent national change and fulfilling the legislative commitments.
Now, you mentioned you go to the different regions, you present to the government as you're rolling this, or before the fisheries audit is rolled out, get feedback and so forth. Reconciliation is a big priority for this government and for this country. Does Oceana Canada go to specific nation-specific groups, like Indigenous groups, to be able to speak to them who have a vested interest in their own fisheries?
Yeah, we actually last year held a fisheries symposium, and we had widespread participation from academia and the government of Canada and leaders from a variety of Indigenous groups, harvester associations. And we also held workshop series that were specific on Indigenous priorities for rebuilding abundance. And so we have a lot of wonderful feedback and interactions with Indigenous leaders that have led us to really hone in on some of those priorities and alignments to rebuild abundance. And actually this year we really started highlighting the way Indigenous knowledge systems can contribute to ecosystem resilience and abundance, and hired a consultant to help us with this work. And he's very well versed in this field and had a lot of really valuable contributions there. And so
Nice.
We are really aiming to progress both the government's commitments to reconciliation and how that it really affects, the fisheries management system on a whole.
Now, with this one, I mean, there's going to be a number 8, an 8th official fisheries audit next year for 2024. What? Let's talk a little bit. We're coming to the new year. Let's talk about predictions. What do you predict is going to happen? And this is totally a prediction. It's not going to. I'm not asking you to predict real things here. What's your predictions for next year? What do you expect to see? And then what do you hope to see in the data that's coming out next year?
Well, it is hard to predict. For example, what a new minister what direction they may take. So we really would like to see strong ecosystem-based and rebuilding-focused agenda in the coming season. And, really should not be accepting the current state of our fisheries and, going with the status quo. We have this strong groundwork that has been laid, and to take steps for a better future and to act with urgency against climate change. And so with that, we conducted a little analysis on the potential for fisheries to rebuild if both climate change was accounted for and mitigated, and if the decisions that were being made reflected the rebuilding regulations. And we found that in just around 10 years, we could have 80% healthy fisheries. So, there really is a positive path forward, and we don't have to accept the current state of our fisheries. In fact, we shouldn't. And so really taking steps towards fulfilling that vision for the future is something that I would like to see.
Yeah, absolutely. A great call to action that we'd like to see for the government to be able to do and get our management, in check and our fisheries in check. Now I have we have an audience. You're part of this audience. You mentioned you listened to the podcast, which is wonderful to hear. But like the audience members that I speak to, and they're very results driven. They want to help. So if you were to offer any kind of advice, now there are people who are in Canada, there are a lot of people who are in the US, all over the world. What would you recommend that they do to help us achieve sort of these management and put a little more pressure on the government?
I really appreciate that. Yes, I am a big fan of the podcast and hope that your listeners have at least heard of Oceana Canada. But if they haven't,
Absolutely.
or if they're interested in learning more about the fishery audit, it is available through our website on oceana.ca. And I encourage you, we're in podcast form, so you can't really see the report and some of the beautiful images we were talking about. But, really learning more and sharing that information with decision makers. We do have a petition that they can sign, but it really is about, furthering our understanding and not accepting the state of our fisheries as is moving forward. And then looking ahead, in the spring, we should be expecting more rebuilding plans. We need to be advocating for including more fish stocks in the Fisheries Act so that they can have the best possible measures for recovery, and that the quota decisions next year are based on science and have that long-term vision for a healthy fishery.
That would be absolutely amazing. And just to let people know that although you're listening to this in audio format, I will put the link in the show notes to, I believe it's in a PDF format, or to the website where you can click on the website and it actually brings it up really nicely. You can put a full screen and you can get all those images just right to your eyes. It's actually quite nice. And just all the graphs and everything. Take a read through it. Learn about, Canadian, not only Canadian fisheries, but also your own, and let's pressure more governments and work with organizations that are working with governments to get these management perspectives in check. And so if we're not that far off, we can get this done. I'd like to see more of a positive trend than a negative trend that we've seen in the last few years. So it's time that government steps up and we make them step up and work with them to help them out. So I think that's a positive call to action, if you will, if we can get that going. So that'll be great. But Rebecca, thank you so much for lending your time to come on the podcast. It's really great to have you, especially somebody who is a listener as well. It's always great to have you on. And if you have any kind of updates in the new year, please let us know. You're more than welcome to come back on to talk about it. We'd love to hear how this is progressing and what those work plans look like and what they're going to do and how that can help us improve. So again, thank you so much. We really appreciate not only the work you do on these fisheries audits, but also coming on here and telling us all about it. It's really nice of you to do that.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us on the podcast today. It's great to be able to not only hear from Oceana Canada and their position and to describe the fisheries audit, but it's also great to have a fan of the show, a listener of the show on the podcast. It's always great to see that. I'm very blessed to have people in the audience that work within sort of the realms of ocean conservation and, marine biology and marine science. And so if you have a report or you're working with an organization, ask your organization if it's okay if you come on the podcast and give me a shout. I'd love to hear from you. Just go to my DMs in Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean, just at How to Protect the Ocean on Instagram. Let me know how you feel, or if you let me know what you're up to, or if you want to go and do a formal email, you can go to speakupforblue.com. Just hit the contact us page. So it's speakupforblue.com/contact. Fill out the form, and it goes right to my email. So it goes right to me, and I'll answer you back as soon as possible. But this is one of the last episodes of the 2023 year, and I think it's a great episode to be putting together because It's something that sums up 2023 in fisheries. And I don't really get to talk a lot about fisheries, especially the fisheries in Canada, which is near and dear to my heart. We want to see these populations get healthier, these stocks get healthier. And the only way to do that is to put together a management plan or a rebuilding plan for those critical species and make sure that we implement it. As I mentioned to Rebecca after the program, is this government in Canada is great at announcing things, but it's really slow to implement things. And that is not a good track record for a government. I'd love to see this government start to implement these plans a little better, and not sure why they're not. So, if you have a chance to be able to speak to your government representative, if you live in Canada or if you live outside of Canada, look up an MP and say, a member of parliament, and say, hey, you know what? What are we doing about these fishery stocks? This fisheries audit is not good. And we want to make sure that we get healthier fishery stocks, because a healthy fishery stocks in Canada probably means healthier fishery stocks in the US and worldwide. So let's start making our government accountable. And these fisheries audits and these types of documents really help. There's a lot of work that goes into that. Rebecca and her colleagues put in a lot of effort, not only in the data analysis and the interpretation, but the presentation as well. I'm going to put the link to that document. It's a really quick document. You can go through it pretty quickly. Really easy to read. I'm going to put the link to the fisheries audit in the show notes. So if you're listening to this on an app and you go into that app and you look at the notes that are part of this show that gives you more details on the show, there's going to be a link to that PDF, or really it's more of a website, and then you can get the PDF from there. But that's it for today's show. I want to thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Rebecca, of course, and thank you, everybody else, for listening. If you know someone who would benefit from hearing this podcast, please feel free to just copy that link on your podcast app and send it right to the people. I'd love to hear more people listening to the show. But other than that, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.